Okay, so it's high time for us to make a start on the next episode of In Conversation with Choices, where we get to the nitty-gritty of various aspects of languages. And today it gives me great pleasure to welcome Kacper Łodzikowski, who's been recently a very sought-after speaker at various events, both online and in person. Kacper is now Vice President of AI Capabilities at Pearson, a global educational company who nowadays, I guess, is the leader of providing educational solutions and services. Kacper is also doing a fair share of academic work, and he's also a lecturer at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, where he delivers classes in AI to students of English language and linguistics. So let me welcome you, Kacper, to this episode.
Hey, Łukasz, good to see you again, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Kacper, let's start off with a bit of a hot potato question, in the sense that we've been recently, I guess, witnessing a lot of scaremongering in terms of AI, Gen AI in particular, and its impact on societies globally. I do think that we've experienced a lot of scaremongering as part of various political debates. Immigrants coming, taking over jobs, doing nasty things to various people, the LGBT community killing the traditional family model, etc., etc. Nowadays, it's the AI, right? So AI is killing jobs. It's going to take jobs from people, going to make them redundant. And sadly, the recent contribution of Elon Musk during his very peculiar debate with Rishi Sunak kind of strengthened those fears, right? When he said that actually, he expects that a point in time is going to come where nobody will have to do the job they might want to do, their jobs as kind of a hobby thing. What's your stance here?
So it is an interesting. It has been an interesting year because AI. AI is not a new technology. It was that field emerged after the Second World War, and we can talk about some uses of AI in education, which date back to the 70s. But it's only now, over the past year, that the AI really got into this the mainstream and into people's perceptions of as a technology. So you mentioned the UK, the UK summit hosted by Prime Minister Sunak in the UK. I think that was a good first step, just to get all the countries together, agree on the risks and on the opportunities as well, and try to at least outline path forward, even though there weren't actually any sort of practical commitments just yet. Like the one thing that could go wrong is not that AI will go rogue in itself, but the countries, or especially the biggest countries on the world, won't be able to collaborate on regulation, for example, or potential misuses of AI for, let's say, fake news or any other sort of more dangerous uses such as terrorism. So, knowing what I know about AI and stuff, I think you have a different perspective when you work on AI systems. It's still hard to, even for us to make them work properly for the good use cases. I'm not really yet. I think it's too early to say or to be that anxious about the future. We certainly should start thinking about universal basic income. That is a good topic, but certainly not killer robots or even AI taking people's jobs. There was a study from 2016 which looked at which aimed to predict the impact of AI on jobs, impact of AI and robotics, because that's all. These are two different technologies, but they often work in tandem. And they made some predictions on how that would impact the job market. And just this year, there was a paper released by using data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics and looking back at the two past decades of AI and robotics. And it's pretty much had a net zero impact on the US job market, because in some cases, you had industries such as farming, where certain types of tasks got automated, but then that actually, if a farm produces more produce, then that actually creates more jobs in, let's say, logistics and distribution and sales and so on. And same, that study looked at, for example, jobs in cleaning and like housekeeping. So despite Roombas, despite the proliferation of those types of automation, there were actually more jobs. There was an increase of jobs over the past 2 decades in that particular industry. So overall, even if you look at at education and translation, for example, there's more jobs for translators right now, based on that paper, for example, than 2 decades ago, and technology only actually contributed to that.
Right, that's super interesting. And yeah, you've also mentioned an interesting aspect of introducing Gen AI on a global scale, that is regulators, and how the implementation of Gen AI is going to be regulated both globally and locally. Can we say globally, perhaps? Right, and this is one of the focal points that was brought up during Sunak's and Musk's discussion. And I think that both of them agreed that it's virtually impossible for governmental regulators to keep up with the innovation and with the IT R&D people, right? How do you see that issue in terms of getting Gen AI implemented in a safe, responsible, and ethical manner as possible?
So, it is interesting, because we already have some laws in certain countries that do touch upon algorithmic decision making. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So you may know Trivago, for example. That's the website which offers hotel bookings. They actually got fined for about 50 million Australian dollars a couple of years ago, because their algorithm, which is a machine learning algorithm, so not generative AI, but still a type of AI, that algorithm promoted hotel bookings, which were not the cheapest, which is what the ad said, the TV ad for Trivago, but it promoted certain ads that were sponsored by the hotel provider. We had a case, there was a case with the government agency, the Dutch tax authority, which was fined for about 3 million euros a couple of years ago, because their model, which predicted whether someone maybe is committing fraud, it actually was biased towards certain cases. Well, I think when someone had a dual citizenship, that person was kind of flagged as a fraudster. So we already have some laws such as the GDPR, because the Dutch tax authority got fined because of the GDPR, which regulate what you should and shouldn't do when it comes to automated decision making. Because AI is pretty much that. It's automated decision making. It's taking a task from a human and just scaling it automatically. And what's going to happen right now, you have this sort of slew, this upcoming tidal wave of regulation, which is not really coordinated. So you have China, which is leading on quite strict AI regulations, where AI developers are liable for the data that is used for model training. They are liable if the model produces output which is somehow misleading or not really according to the governmental sort of requirements. In the UK is now trying to come up with its own regulation, which is kind of possibly modeled, after what the EU. That's the Brussels effect in action. So the EU leads in some regulation, the UK, the US follows. We've got Brazil that actually outlined some regulation 3 years ago, I think, but then they didn't yet vote it into law. But that was, they are looking to lead in South America. Spain recently announced that they will set up their own, first in the EU, AI agency, which will actually employ subject matter experts to try and regulate and inspect models. So there's a lot of what happens. You can see that there's not yet, and that's, I guess, in coming back to the summit and the scaremongering. We should be cognizant of the opportunities and the risks, but I guess overall that summit was a good first step towards maybe trying to at least agree on some sort of interoperability between the frameworks. Because right now, President Biden in the US announced his executive order, which will treated as AI as types of technologies, whereas in the EU the approach is different. The EU looks at AI when it comes to use cases. So we can have a use case where AI is allowed, such as in video games, and that doesn't really matter what the type of AI is, but we have use cases which are classified as higher risk, and that's education, for example. Education is, out of the 4 categories, it's category number 3, so it's allowed, but it's like high risk, so you have to go through a lot of administrative hoops if the law actually goes into effect. So it doesn't really matter what type of AI you use, but if you use it for education, then you have to go through a lot. So then you have like these a couple of different approaches. And then it's all needed. And it's been a wild west for the past year or so. It's like building a highway and building cars without really providing the road code. And what we're doing now is kind of providing the road codes that we can at least make the development and implementation of those systems more predictable for the people.
That's a great metaphor you've used here. Right, absolutely. Right, speaking of education, but with a sort of, a particular twist on it, would you say that this angst that people feel towards, towards Gen AI is caused by the lack of education, and, lack of kind of AI literacy, and because, let's face it, since November 30th, 2022, the AI has been mushrooming everywhere, so it's virtually impossible to live a regular life and not come into contact AI, whether we're aware of it or not. So would you say that more educational campaigns, awareness campaigns, would benefit the great society?
You're making a good point here. People use AI more than they think, and the bar for what AI is, that keeps increasing. The GPS, that people use in their cars. Remember back in the day, before Google Maps, before the phones, some people would buy like the physical boxes, like the hardware box. They would put it in the car, and they would upload a map from a pen drive. GPS is an automated decision-making system based on the signal you deliver to the satellite. That gives you something back, and that tries to guide you. And if you make the wrong turn, it tries to redirect you. That you could call that an example of AI. Same, if you open your something like Microsoft Word and you start making some grammar errors, the grammar checker pops up and it says, well, you shouldn't really use that sentence. That's the structure here. That is an example of a very simple AI model. Grammar is an example of an AI model. So Alexa, Siri, the things that people use nowadays very frequently without even thinking. These are all examples of AI. It's just that now, with generative AI, when those systems now can talk back to you and they can conduct some tasks that people usually conducted in language, so writing stuff, summarizing stuff, and so on, writing rap songs or writing poems. This is now people kind of feel, okay, this is this is an agent that has some agency as to how it behaves. People certainly need to be educated about what this is, what the limitations of this technology are, what it can be used for. Because for the most part, I think it's going to help people, just like with any other technology that can be used for good or for bad. The difference here with generative AI is that, as opposed to the prior waves of AI, which mainly automated physical work, AI and automation and robotics, and maybe impacted, or was noticeable in sort of blue collar tasks. We mentioned farming, for example, or manufacturing. This is now we're now facing AI technologies that conduct white collar tasks. So they can write stuff for you. They can write a report for you. They can write an essay. And this is now where we have those discussions. along the lines of, okay, should I as a teacher still ask my students to write up essays if I know they will use a model to do that? Like, what is the role of the human, and how the role of the human in the economy changes from a writer towards an editor of what the AI wrote. So I think that's certainly something where governmental and non-profit and even commercial companies should educate the society or their consumers, because that will only benefit them.
Cheers for that. You've actually addressed one of the questions that I jotted down preparing myself for our conversation here, and these were questions related to your recent participation in the CASI conference in China, right? So that's, I guess, developing AI versus regulations. But there's also a super interesting point that you made in one of your LinkedIn posts, which is related to actionability and reliability and the implementation of Gen AI on a larger scale in the business environment. You've already mentioned, white collar workers being, well, kind of the work of these people being automated to a certain extent. But what is the insight here in terms of global corporations employing AI in the work stream?
And you mentioned the Casey conference. I'll address that because that was an education conference. We can kind of touch upon education as well.
Absolutely, we will.
The one thing that, if we look at the job market and companies in general, and coming back to this scaremongering, I guess we'll keep coming back to that since we started with that. The one thing that is becoming kind of a cliche right now is the phrase that, AI won't take your job, a human using AI will. And we are in this reality where we probably need to accept the fact that the technology is here to stay. We need to embrace it. It is being embedded in everyday tools. So Microsoft just embedded it in Outlook, Word. Google did the same. My wife is a software developer, and she just sent me an article today, I think from the New York Times, about the impact of generative AI on software development jobs, and how those jobs will change. So certainly for companies and for knowledge workers in general, we are seeing this shift towards first draft automation, which is AI is used to do the work, like bootstrap the work, and then you kind of take over. You don't start from scratch. You take over from the AI, and this works reasonably well for press releases, for job descriptions, for HR roles, for programming jobs, and it certainly won't take people's jobs because we need to think about tasks rather than jobs. So it'll help you do some tasks. It won't take your entire job, especially again like a software developer. On a good day, probably maybe spends half of their time coding. The actual work is meeting people, talking to people, communicating their ideas, summarizing, negotiating. So these are things that AI won't do yet, especially since it's not sanctioned. It cannot sort of act on its own. So that's what the companies, we should certainly look at the types of tasks that can be automated so that people can be freed up to do more meaningful work. And the same applies to certain jobs such as teachers. Like one of the things I discussed at the Casey Education Conference in China was what else what can we do with this technology to sort of take the best aspects of teachers and apply them to the particular tasks that teachers often don't have the time to do properly. I'll give you one example. So if we look at education in general, like at the center of education lies assessment. So the ability of you as a teacher to make claims about what to diagnose, to make claims about what they know and what they don't know. And there are three foundations of assessment. It's validity, so whether you measure what you're supposed to measure, fairness, so whether you're not biased against any particular group of learners, and then reliability, so whether you conduct the assessment reliably over numerous occasions. And humans are actually pretty good at validity because we are natural users of language. We can get we can quickly diagnose whether someone is a mastered English, say, or any other language at a certain level of proficiency. But we often struggle with the bias because we can be unconsciously biased when it comes to personality, appearance, body language, all sorts of factors that AI, if we program it well, it won't be distracted by those factors. It won't care about what you're wearing, whether your accent is non-native, if you do the job well. So for aspects such as fairness or aspects such as reliability, where again humans are great. You and I are both teachers, so we know the feeling that you get a lot of homework that needs to be graded. It's a different experience when it's Monday morning, or if it's Friday evening, or worse, like Saturday evening, and you run out of coffee, you're tired, you're getting inconsistent in your grading, and you start just like doing the work in a sloppy way. AI won't care. AI is available 24/7. It'll rate the homework in the same way, regardless of time of the day. So there are certainly, again, like things where we should just welcome AI because it'll make our jobs easier. In the case of teachers, it'll make the learning experience better for our students. But it's just, it'll take time to bridge the gap from where we are today to where we need to go in terms of technology, perception, training, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, taking away things which are mundane and very down to earth, repetitive from teachers is something that yes, I guess most of us would be looking forward to, right? I've recently attended a conference in Stuttgart of ITAF with a particular focus on business English, and one of the speakers was actually reporting on her experiences with Gen AI and generating evaluation rubrics for her students, so large cohorts of students. So it was extremely helpful for her, right? One of the previous guests on these podcast series said that he kind of fed past essays that he evaluated of his students, and then he kind of played with the ChatGPT, trying to see whether it would actually rate those essays in accordance with his sort of guidance and also his preferences as far as what a good essay is, and it actually worked. So it's absolutely brilliant. So taking those super mundane, down-to-earth jobs from teachers is definitely a plus, right? Isn't it? Right. How about yourself? How do you use Gen AI in your own teaching?
So that's funny because actually I spoke at one conference on Monday, also in Germany. Actually, I was in Vienna. Where we had a workshop with teachers and school staff members on creating personalized materials using generative AI. And then I actually the next day also used it to prepare materials for my own class. So AI is really good. It is this sort of shift from the previous generations of AI, where the AI was, good at taking input from you and assessing that and providing you with a score or feedback. We've had systems from Pearson actually built the very first system for automated essay scoring back in the mid to late 90s. So it's been almost 3 decades of R&D on that. These are some of the systems that still work together, where you can as a teacher can assign an essay, and the system will the learner will submit the essay back, and the system will give feedback, and you can kind of go into that loop where you resubmit the essay, you improve your scores on grammar, vocab, semantics, and so on. But that was kind of limited in that the feedback needed to be pre-scripted. The systems needed to be trained on a lot of data. This usually involved learners submitting a lot of their essays, a lot of their work, also spoken work, and teachers actually grading that, and that was used to train models. So these models performed reasonably well, but they were kind of applied only to a narrow slice. Whereas with large language models, and with those types of technologies, we can kind of have this back and forth dialogue with the system. And if the system is grounded in facts and factual knowledge, you can actually have quite a helpful discussion that for me as a teacher, I often use that to actually maybe check my own assumptions, whether I understand the topic correctly, because I sometimes find I don't. I thought maybe I needed, but if as a teacher, you really need to know. If you try to, the best way to learn something is to teach someone, try to teach to someone. And I noticed that I have those dialogues often when I just double check my assumption whether something is correct, or I try to make a parallel. I teach AI, so I would ask the system about statistical models and AI models, and I ask, okay, how does that compare to that? And you can get that feedback immediately. So that's awesome for checking your own assumptions and just educating yourself before you communicate to work with students. And then I do use it for creating multiple choice questions for formative assessment within the classroom. So I would use one of those interactive presentation tools which can embed open-ended or multiple choice questions. And I find that it won't really. It's okay. I use LLMs for generating ideas for questions. I often need to pick the best questions and kind of fine-tune them. But then for coming up with answers or distractors or funny distractors, this is where these tools shine. And they really help me just prepare material which is personalized for the class faster. So I pretty much use those tools pretty much every day. I'm not going back.
Yeah, yeah. There's no going back, as you're saying. Yeah. Would you say that you kind of feel this nostalgia towards not having to be that creative and productive? Is there any sentiment there?
Yeah, it is an interesting question. As of today, I don't think that the AI takes away. I still need to be quite creative in how I use the tool, and I noticed that with some other teachers, as part of the work, I met some really awesome teachers in Germany on Monday who use AI in ways I didn't even thought are possible. They create their own sort of custom prompts that they then hand over to the learners so that the system, the LLM, such as ChatGPT or any other free tool, plays a certain role, like an angry customer you have to negotiate with, or another student where then it's not an interaction. We then treat the AI as the teacher or the tutor. We treat the AI as another student, so you can have a student-to-student discussion, and actually the human student becomes the teacher of AI, which is pretending to be a student. So something completely innovative, and it's easy to create those types of interactive, formative assessment experiences, but you really need to use your creativity. You need to be properly trained. So on its own, the AI system won't really do anything. It'll, if you don't really think about what you want to do, and if you don't ground it in learning science or learning design, then it'll do something, but that will not necessarily produce good results.
So yeah, thanks for that. And I guess we are kind of inevitably, smoothly sailing towards the next question, which is AI literacy. And this is what you do. Yeah, this is kind of your contribution to educating your students who are in the English language and linguistics program, right? Have you noticed any soaring of interest in terms of the timing that is post November 30th, 2022? Would you say that these students of yours are more keen on learning what AI is and how to become fluent in using it?
That is an interesting observation. So we're actually nearing the 1 year anniversary of ChatGPT release, because it was released on the final day of November last year.
Are you celebrating? Are you celebrating?
I guess we all should in a way, because it is a great tool that is made available for free. We can have a discussion as to whether that was a good move, whether that should have been rolled out broadly, or whether it should have been maybe made available to certain groups. Because as soon as it got released, it was used for good and for bad. So you now have GPT style fraud bots. That's another story. I think we noticed two things over the past year. Like one is when it comes to the students, and then the other when it comes to the educators. So let's start with educators. So educators, we noticed that this initial knee-jerk kind of reaction was ban the tool until we kind of know what's going on. So you would have, especially in the US, I think, certain schools blocking access to ChatGPT within the school network. So that was December, January. And then so the next wave of that was, okay, maybe coming up with short-term strategies for how to deal with it, how to maybe start embracing it with caution. So, Pearson helped prepare such guidance for the UK Association of it's the Joint Council for Qualifications, like a body for Association for Assessment in the UK, which we are a part of, and we help create those guidelines to sort of educate assessors and teachers on how to start implementing those tools in the class, how to actually educate the learners as well, and the test takers on what's ethical use and what compliant use, versus maybe what is a misuse of this technology, and how to maybe spot misuse. So don't just rely on the submitted homework. Actually, sometimes ask the student to see whether they actually are learning something, that kind of thing. And then the final wave that we saw after maybe the first 6 months in May this year was when governments and the US government actually led that, started releasing their own kind of policies and white papers. The US Department of Education released a report in May where they kind of envisioned the future of education with AI. And that was quite a positive report, saying what the opportunities and what this long-term roadmap is. So I think for educators and for governments and regulators, we saw that sort of move from knee-jerk towards embracing and envisioning the future. And for learners, that was actually quite interesting for me to observe, because I was teaching when ChatGPT got released, and actually soon after it was released, a test was due. And it was an online test, on Moodle, which we used at the faculty. And before the test, because my students always could use any other tools, such as the internet or textbooks, to take the test, because I wanted to prepare them for real life AI work. And I asked them two questions. Like, one is, okay, do you think you can use ChatGPT? And actually, most of them were not so sure whether they can use it. So I made sure they feel comfortable using it. And then after they took the test, I asked them whether it was actually helpful for them to use it. And back in the day, that was, I think, December, most of them actually said it wasn't that helpful. It slowed them down because they weren't really sure how to use it. And it got certain answers on the test correctly, certain answers were wrong. It actually dealt reasonably well with open-ended answers where the students were supposed to create something. And I see that today, after we've educated that particular cohort, they can now use those tools better. And I think they find it helpful, because it is the best next thing we have. Human teachers are not going away, but this is the best, next best thing we have to sort of human tutor style sort of relationship, where it's 2 a.m. you study for the test next day, and you for the life of you cannot grasp this particular problem, or but then you can sort of have this conversation with the tutor. Maybe it's helpful, maybe not, but at least you're sort of constructing some knowledge, and you're kind of maybe getting some help.
Yeah. Now, for instance, when it comes to ChatGPT, you're able to kind of customize it, right, to suit your needs. So that's what I've been doing for the past 2 weeks, trying to arrive at a perfect German language tutor that's going to, bring my German language skills up to speed. So yes, it's been pretty useful and kind of, fun to interact with. So coming back to this AI course that you do at your university, what would you say are the most critical, 3 most critical AI literacy skills?
Okay. Yeah, so I guess it depends on the role. So whether it's the learner or whether it's the teacher. It's actually funny that we should talk about literacy, because really it's not just AI literacy. It's actually like general purpose computer literacy. And I recently took part in an event accompanying this past summit, the UN summit on sustainable development goals. And I actually looked at the statistics because one of the sustainable development goals is education. It's goal number 4. And I actually looked at the statistics for education for Poland, because I thought, well, I mean, education certainly is not a problem in Poland. I mean, come on, we don't really see it that often. But then, and the statistics kind of depend on the year. You get different types of skills are measured in different years. I was surprised to see that in 2012, only about 80% of the Polish population were literate and numerate, so you could read and count. Then in 2015, only about 1/3 of the population knew how to copy and paste text within a document. Then in 2019, only about half of the population knew how to move a folder on the computer from one place to another. So there's still much to be done in like basic computer literacy in terms of how people interact with the computer, how they use tools. Because next year, next time you buy a computer with Windows and with Office, AI will be there. It will be part of the suite. So we won't really talk that much about AI literacy per se. It'll be still like computer literacy, or maybe even basic literacy and numeracy. But if we really want to talk about trying to tease something out, coming back to scaremongering in jobs and education, I guess maybe we should think about AI not as a replacement of you, of your certain tasks, or of learning. It's a supplement to it. So certainly should embrace it as that. So for teachers, for example, learn how to understand the basics of the technology, but primarily understand, set some guidelines for you and like a contract between you and the students as to how to use it in the classrooms. Okay, which uses are allowed, which are not allowed. Should you, as a student, if you use AI, should you then cite it? Should you say use it, or should you just treat it just like a grammar checker, which we don't cite per se? And then that will provide the foundation for how to actually use AI in the classroom. And then for the broader population, I think just getting approaching it with an open mind and curiosity, and just try and use it. I think that's the best way to really understand where it can help you, be it in your personal life or professional life. I'm sure there are some use cases, just like making that first step and accepting. Maybe it's just checking that ego in certain cases, and accepting that it's potentially helpful piece of technology that is here to stay, and it's only going to get better. There's I'm playing around with it. Probably that's, I guess, my number one tip for everyone.
Absolutely right. Yes, and let me pick you on one interesting thing that you mentioned: citing. Yes, it's like it runs in the academic DNA, I guess. Right? It's part and parcel of academic integrity that whenever you borrow somebody's words or thoughts or ideas, you ought to cite them. Right? Whom to cite? Yes, if you're getting those ideas from LLMs.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We need to have answers, and again, we've seen again some knee-jerk reactions here, from certain journals or conferences where they outright ban the use of large language models or generative AI, which I think is maybe too reactive, because these are good tools for writing stuff up. Like one of the things I do when I write up an abstract, I create a bullet pointed list of what I want to cover, and then I ask the system to just write it, and it does. It does it better than me, and I ask it to make it longer, shorter, at a low language proficiency, at a higher proficiency, and so on. So that's a good use of the tool. Relying on fact, trying to choose, writing a history essay with an L, that's where it kind of gets tricky, because you need to that system by default tries to be grounded in all the textbooks or content it read about the topic, but it can often hallucinate. By the way, word of the year, I think, just like announced this year.
Is it?
Yeah, I think so. Hallucination. So when the model kind of doesn't it's inadvertent, but it's the outputs the text word by word, and it makes one mistake, and that kind of steers it towards a direction maybe it shouldn't follow. So there are now things that researchers from the AI community are trying to implement some solutions to ground models more in facts and in factual sources. But that's like one case where I wouldn't really you probably would need to cite ChatGPT in that particular case, saying, okay, I guess I couldn't go to the library. Then I don't know, the Wikipedia was offline. I didn't have any books because I burned them for fuel, and I used ChatGPT to just like help me write a history essay, and ChatGPT claims these are the facts. So I cite it. But any other use case, I wouldn't really cite it. But again, I'm open to we need some guidance, not only for writing, but I'll give you another example. Reviewing papers. So I'm still an active academic reviewer, and I do use LLMs for helping me peer review someone's work. So I first read the work and I annotate it, and then I feed the text into the model. And usually the model is far more optimistic than me about the text, so far more positive and encouraging. But sometimes it does catch things that I don't. So there's on page 3, the authors said something like they said the sample, the number of people in the study is 42. Then in the table 10 pages later, they say it's actually 59. And I didn't caught that, but the model did. So that's another use case for we need those machines to try and sort of supplement the things that humans are not that good at. And I'm open in that case. I'm super happy for if the journal says you need to like tick a box if you use AI, or I don't know, whatever the reviewer needs to do. But it doesn't. Again, coming back to the main point, there's no turning back from these types of tools, and all sorts of jobs, all sorts of tasks can be made more efficient if they rely on certain types of automation, which is implemented, in a well-designed manner and evaluated properly.
Yeah, I'm happy that you're mentioning this unpaid academic chore, which is reviewing, right? And sort of using Gen AI to help us out here. Absolutely. Now, you've also mentioned hallucinations, and I've recently come across this hallucination leaderboard, which basically says that LLMs can hallucinate anything between 27.2%, that's Google Palm 2, down to 3%, and that's GPT-4. One thing that, when I think about hallucinations using LLMs in higher ed, or be it any other level of education, is critical thinking and developing the critical thinking skills, especially with regard to hallucinations. Would you say it's a justified use of LLMs here?
So let's sort of touch upon the hallucinations. I mean, now there was an interesting paper which I encourage the listeners or viewers to have a look at, written by mostly by researchers from the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI. So Stanford HAI, they call the lab HAI. And the paper was it was a transparency index of LLMs. It was released very recently, and that paper is quite technical, but it has a nice table in one of the pages where the review the authors propose a framework for evaluating models. Well, actually, starting with model development, what data was used to train the model, what the process was for training the model, evaluating the model, providing support for model, and then they looked at like some of the leading models, and actually the results were sort of quite pessimistic in terms of the quality of some of the models and the sort of level of, I guess, attention that is paid to developing those models by some of the big tech companies. And the funny thing was actually that some of the open source models, so the models for which the code is available publicly and the data sets are usually available as well, these were actually the models that scored usually the highest. So Bloom, there's a language model called Bloom. It's probably less known for your listeners because it's not it's of good quality, but it's not in the mainstream because it's one of those open source models. You have to kind of go install it, but it's one of those models where I guess in general it's easier for everyone to see and try to maybe understand why the model behaves a certain way, because it is open compared to some of the models such as GPT or ChatGPT, which is totally untransparent and black box. We don't really know what data was trained on. We don't really know how it was trained. We don't know the architecture. We can really just rely on the blog post announcement, and the sort of media hype around it. So and then I sort of started by sort of answering your question, starting sort of from by the foundation. But hallucination and the things we can do about it. That coming back to regulation and the UK summit, one good thing that came out of that summit is this agreement that we need to set up an agency that will try to lead in the development of next generation AI, maybe in a way that is more, I wouldn't like to say regulated, but in a way at least coordinated, in that we need to meet certain criteria for model development so that people can actually understand better how those models perform. So we have some sort of thresholds, some benchmarks for model quality, as opposed to what happened now, which is released a technology which is quite experimental, into the wild, and people used it and misused it, like in those sort of cases we heard in the media where a lawyer would use ChatGPT to write up a defense, and the model hallucinated some use cases, and the lawyer said, well, I didn't know that those models can make up facts, and someone lost the case. So I guess we're all learning and starting to sort of grasp the opportunities and risks.
Absolutely. So how are you learning and grasping those opportunities when it comes to your specialization that is, blending Gen AI and language learning, because this is what you've been doing for over a decade now, right? Yeah. So how has this landscape changed over the years, and how do you think it's going to evolve in the, I wouldn't dare to say years to come, but months to come?
Well, one of the things that I always remind people is AI in education is not new. AI has been used successfully in education since the 70s. There were some of the very early systems, but actually not that different from what ChatGPT is today. They also employed a text-based interface where you could have a dialogue with the system, but the world knowledge, the domain knowledge of the system, that was limited to rules written by a human. Whereas today, what we have today is you have a neural network which reads all the possible books and all the possible Wikipedia pages, and it creates its own knowledge model which presents us with different opportunities. So a lot of the one thing that is certainly changing right now when it comes to AI education, which we are sort of monitoring closely, is where to apply these technologies, or in which particular areas it makes sense to apply those technologies. Because again, for most of my career in education and in AI, those AI systems were developed with a human in the loop, in the sense that if you want to develop a system for automated essay assessment, let's say, for it to give feedback on your writing, you would first collect some data from the learners, some essays, humans would score it, and those annotations humans made on essays, that would be used for training the model, so that the model, the next time it sees an essay, a for and against essay on any topic that we usually assign it in an English language learning class, next time it sees an essay, it would pretty much agree with the human in 97% of cases in terms of how it's scored. So the agreement between the machine and the human is higher than the agreement between two humans. And as you know, sometimes humans can have different opinions about whether an essay is a 4 or a 5. And what changed with generative AI is that these models, like we said, they are trained without human supervision. So they go to the library, they read all the possible books and Wikipedia articles, and they come up with some capabilities, and they can perform all sorts of tasks reasonably well. But then, out of the box, those models cannot be reliably used for all the possible use cases. And you mentioned you're building a tutor for German. One thing that I'm doing right now in my academic career is we built and deployed actually this week a tutor for advanced learners of English at an academic level for English phonetics and phonology, where it's still very difficult for us to try and steer the model into behaving how we want it to behave. So mimicking your academic instructor in terms of sticking to facts, sticking to certain rules of transcribing speech into text. That model still hallucinates, even though we grounded it in academic textbooks. So that kind of a critical evaluation of where to apply this technology, and then piloting and validation, that's something that needs to happen. And again, the best way is just to stay on top of what I do, is stay on top of of research, reading papers every day about AI development, about applying AI education. I can recommend hotly Ethan Mollick, who is I think one of the best people to follow when it comes to what you as the teacher can and as a student can do with large language models such as ChatGPT. So again, I guess you need to approach this all with an open mind, and not to just try and be balanced, not to go either too far into the scaremongering and just like denial of technology, but also don't really be too optimistic, because I'm sure you noticed as well with your German tutor, it's not totally reliable, and there are some use cases. Maybe it's a formative assessment, remediation, maybe practice, low stakes, where it's probably fine. Yep. Especially if you train your learners in using that. Whereas we certainly wouldn't use that for summative, high stakes assessment where that model needs to be reliable.
Definitely. So you've already mentioned your contribution to your Gen AI contribution to teaching at the higher ed level. How about the products and services that you developed within your role at Pearson? So what would you consider are the sort of the milestones in terms of producing various, coming up with different educational products and services?
And actually, let me give you 3 examples of what we're doing right now, and sort of tying it back to generative AI as the sort of catalyst for change and how we approach education in general, how we approach building educational products. So I think the biggest opportunity that generative AI presents is for formative assessment, so instruction, remediation, stretch. And there are 3 main opportunities here that I see. First is, take the types of systems we would build up until today, such as the system that I mentioned for automated assessment of essays or speech, that until now were quite costly and time-consuming to develop. So we can take a system that we would usually apply for high-stakes assessment, make it less rigorous, and apply it to test prep, for example. So that's one use case to make this technology more available to everyone. The second use case is facilitate the development of soft skills or 21st century skills, such as collaboration or cultural intelligence, so that instead of just learning the language, you're kind of going more into the realm of integrated skills learning. And so you can build easily right now, probably just like you did with your German tutor. You can build you can program the system in natural language using your own language to behave in a certain way. So you can program it to become an angry customer who has lodged a complaint, and you're not only getting feedback on the language you use, whether you use it correctly, you're sort of getting feedback on whether you completed some job tasks correctly. So whether you maybe negotiated, a discount or a subscription, something like that. So that sort of focus not only on one skill, but on a series of integrated skills. That I think is the second opportunity for us. And we're doing some work on that with digital tutors like that. And the second, the final opportunity that we're exploring is just like new types of immersive learning experiences, such as virtual worlds. All those VR headsets, still quite expensive, getting cheaper and more powerful every year. So sooner or later, they will become a commodity. And right now, creating those virtual worlds and those avatars that you can talk to, it is, again, quite costly and time consuming. But large language models make it easier to bootstrap the creation of such avatars. And you can imagine a virtual world where it's kind of like a game where you can talk to non-playable characters. They have the backstory, they can give you quests, but actually underneath you can have this stealth assessment of your capabilities and then get some feedback at the end of the session. So that's like one thing that we are really excited about in terms of moving away from this more traditional conceptualizations of learning and assessment towards something that is more authentic and stuff, maybe also less intrusive.
Yeah, that sounds really great. I mean, yes, in terms of also in terms of buzzwords. Okay, obviously Gen AI, and all of the products that fall within this spectrum have been hitting the headlines pretty hard for the past 12 months or so. But so has the acronym DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? I think it's been a buzzword within the across businesses really for the past 3-4 years. And I was just wondering, how do we ensure that DEI also exists within Gen AIs? As Joshua Pays on the one of the episodes said, garbage in, garbage out. AI can be as racist, as homophobic, whatnot as possible. As human beings are. So how do we ensure that modern Gen AI is DEI driven?
You're raising a very important point, and this is one reason why I am quite happy about the UK Summit, upcoming regulations, and frameworks for governing the development of AI or any other regulatory sandboxes where you first have to pilot the solution, just like with self-driving cars in a sort of sandbox, and only then scale it. Because both image generation models and text generation models were trained on data sets that can perpetuate social cultural biases. Go to ChatGPT right now and ask it, I studied, or I'm going to study math at university just like my ... and see whether it says just like my father or just like my mother. And if you ask the GPT model, in most cases, like we experimented with that, it will say father because it was a male, the male sort of character that was associated with certain types of math or engineering tasks or jobs in the sources that this model was trained on. Same, go to any of those image generation models and ask it to generate an image of a nurse and just see how many of those nurses are male or female. And that's certainly something that, again, coming back to open source models, where we know what data they were trained on, we know how they were designed and trained. That's a consumer choice in the way you can make as a consumer right now, to not use black box closed models and try to use open source models where you can actually understand better and possibly also provide feedback on what you see. There's one interesting development that we see in sort of regional generative AI systems where ChatGPT was trained on a corpus of on a data set of various languages, but English is the predominant language in that data set probably. Whereas you now have the United Arab Emirates released their own model recently called JAIS, which was trained not only on English texts but also on Arabic texts, and people from that background who interact with that model already report that the model just understands them better. It's not about language; it's about this sort of social cultural lens through which the model is perceiving the world, because it was trained on the particular text. Same with China. Baidu just released their own LLM recently, which was trained on Chinese text as well. And so again, it's like one of those. It's a balance, because we can go now, and have every possible country train their own model, and those models will perpetuate these regional biases. On the other hand, we can try and steer the behavior as model, but then you kind of go into, okay, like at which point this becomes censorship and kind of influencing, censoring history and certain types of text. So it's not trivial. We can also we can return to the same guidance I guess we gave, which is always approach it critically and evaluate it before you apply. At least that's one thing that you and I can do as users of those models, and especially as teachers who then maybe ask our students to use those models, educate the students about the risks, and just try to steer them towards the best possible use.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, yet another time critical thinking emerges here, right? And sort of critical evaluation. So I would say one of the top skills. Also, Pearson, I think, has recently produced a report saying that, okay, yes, Gen AI is super important, but the superpowers still remain within the human being, right? So and one of those superpowers is definitely communication, collaboration. How do you see that being impacted by the developments in Gen AI to come?
Yeah, so I think one of the we recently released a report where it was the skills outlook report, focusing on the skills that matter, that's companies and employers are after today, and we sort of made an estimate for the top skills in 2030. So in 7 years, and the employers are after soft skills for the most part. So we call them future skills in that report. We call them 21st century skills, or power skills, or soft skills, this is really something that technology can help us develop, evaluate, and in general sort of supercharge humans across all sorts of tasks. Coming back to example we gave before, like a software developer is still needs to be a good communicator, still needs to be able to negotiate. So these skills don't go away, and really won't go away. And then it's a matter of for us as Pearson, as a company that develops AI models that help diagnose those skills or help develop those skills. And coming back to your previous question about bias, like we have a team here, about 30 people, who every day I get some sort of new report on how we try to break a model, or how we try to improve it, or test it for racial bias or gender bias, or just reliability or fairness against certain backgrounds. So again, coming back to the main, I guess, topic of this conversation, AI is just like a technology, can be used for good and for bad. I'm quite optimistic always, as you know. And I think that the more people you educate, and I think you and I share the same sentiment, that we just need to educate people as much as possible about what we can do with it, how to approach it, and hopefully it'll serve us all, and not rebel and take over the world.
Absolutely right. Would you agree with the conclusion that AI education and science is not just like a fling romance, but it's going to be a great and solid partnership for
it's a marriage of at least 3 decades now. It's strong. And it's if anything, it's like renewing the vows right now. It's like making it so looking back at the past 3 decades or longer actually of AI education, and same for science. And I'm really hopeful that the next couple of decades will bring a renaissance, both when it comes to science and what people can achieve with those models, when it comes to learning more about the world and building some understanding of the world, as well as for education. And thanks for leading this discussion and creating this opportunity for us to have that discussion, because it is a very, very pertinent topic.
My pleasure. And yes, I did. I do have this hope that it's going to be a very, very modest, but yet a contribution to educating people on Gen AI. Before we finish, though, Kacper, could you recommend a few resources, perhaps textbooks? Now, should some of our listeners want to acquaint themselves with AI and state of the art, are there any particular resources that you recommend?
Thanks for asking. So Pearson, we published an AI summer reading list a couple of months ago. If you look that up, we can provide the link in the comments probably later. There was a series of books we released on the topic. Pearson actually has been publishing for the past, I think, 2 decades, the best-selling AI textbook, which we use for technical studies. I use it with my students. We won't recommend that here, but we also publish some sort of lighter entry-level texts. So have a look at that list, and there's one book in there called I think GPT. It's about GPT-4 in medicine. It is domain specific when it comes to medicine, but it does provide a very entry-level, beginner-friendly overview of how to actually start to think about those types of models. How are they sentient? Like, can we say they exhibit human-like reasoning? Does it matter whether they exhibit human-like reasoning? So those types of questions are sort of answered there. On sort of examples of medical diagnosis, which I think many people will relate to, even though if they're not specialists in the field. And then I mentioned Ethan Mollick here before, who is a professor at Wharton School of Business, I think, who publishes quite a lot recently, published materials that teachers and learners will find helpful as to what you, as a single individual, can do with some of the freely available generative AI tools to bootstrap your learning and teaching.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot for that. I'm definitely going to be reaching out to you to get those titles in the description of the episode. Kacper, once again, many, many thanks for agreeing to participate in this episode. And yes, I look forward to keeping in touch.
Thanks for having me, Łukasz.
Cheers. Thanks.